there's only two reasons that men and women differ. One is cultural, and the other is biological. And if you minimize the cultural differences, you maximize the biological differences. I know everyone's shocked when they hear this. This isn't shocking news. People have known this in the scientific community for at least 25 years.
Why do you think so many young men are following you? Because you have a lot of your audience.
Because I want the best for them, genuinely. I'm encouraging them.
More than you do for young women?
No, not
So why do you think so many are young men?
Oh, well, I think part of it's technological fluke. I mean, I came to prominence, at least in part, on YouTube, because I put my university lectures there, and it happens to be the case that 80% of the people who watch YouTube are young men. So there's that, and it's hard to know how to factor that in exactly. But then I think that young women are encouraged a lot, which is fine as far as I'm concerned. But I think that that's less true for young men now, because we believe that there's something pernicious about male competence and activity. It's part of I suppose it's part of the notion that the best way to characterize Western society is as a tyrannical patriarchy, which is an appalling doctrine as far as I'm concerned.
How come is that?
Well, it's not a tyrannical patriarchy. So it's not tyrannical, that's the first thing. Certainly not compared to any other governmental form that currently exists and has ever existed.
What you're doing and doing now as well is challenging the idea of gender equality. Why do you think that can be a problem, the idea of gender equality?
I don't think that equality of opportunity is a problem. I think that's a great thing, and that anyone with any sense champions equality of opportunity. I mean, even if you're purely selfish, say, and purely self-centered, you'd want to set up an economy where everyone who had ability could be maximally exploited by everyone else, because then we can all benefit from each other's talents. And so equality of opportunity is an absolutely useful fundamental principle.
So where's
but that has nothing to do with equality of outcome. Those things aren't even in the same conceptual universe. And to strive for equality of outcome is, well, it's a fool's game and likely to be it has proved to be in the past, extraordinarily dangerous, as well as impossible. The biggest differences between men and women in the world in terms of temperament and interest are in Scandinavia, and they've maximized as a consequence of your egalitarian policies.
What do you mean by that?
It means that the more egalitarian your state, the bigger the personality differences between men and women. That's like How do you measure that? How do you know that? Oh, well, psychologists have perfected, at least to some degree, the measure of personality over the last 30 years with very advanced statistical models. And so what you do is you offer men and women well-validated tests of preference and of personality. And you do that all across the world with tens of thousands of people in multi-country samples. And then you look at the difference between men and women. And then you rank order that by wealth and egalitarian social policy. And what you find is the more egalitarian the society, the more different the men and women become. Is this something you can recognize, or is it?
I would say, for me, it's quite a simple question, actually. Do we want that our sons and daughters should have the same opportunities and the same dreams or hopes for the good thing, or no? And for me, it's simple to answer that. It's yes, of course. So for me, equality and gender equality is very, very important. For me, also when we talk about gender equality, it's important for me to learn my daughter that her mom can lead and show the way, and her dad can hug and kiss her and show feelings. And I think that's something very important for the hoods where kids grow up, to show feelings, to have these gender equality discussions, to show her a way of opportunities and to strive forward. And it's important both for lonely men, lonely young men, but also for women that feel this roof of glass. They need to fight and to struggle the roof of glass to be successful in their lives.
Do you agree on this?
I think that equality of opportunity is a perfectly reasonable proposition. I mean, I have a daughter and a wife. I do everything and many, many female clients, and who I've consulted with and helped, and in many cases helped accelerate the development of their career tremendously. It's obviously of great utility to encourage forward striving in young people and people in general. That's not the issue in the least. The issue is the outcome.
Yeah, well, then why do you think the outcome, and these countries where the outcome is more equal, why do you think that leads to bigger differences between the sexes?
Because there's only two reasons that men and women differ. One is cultural, and the other is biological. And if you minimize the cultural differences, you maximize the biological differences. So, I know everyone's shocked when they hear this. This isn't shocking news. People have known this in the scientific community for at least 25 years. And it's been replicated in the last month 3 times in 3 separate samples, including in Science, which is the world's greatest scientific magazine by a large margin. And it isn't a small effect, it's a huge effect.
But excuse me, what does it mean? Does it mean that Scandinavian men and women are having more difficulties meeting each other, talking to each other than other places?
No, not necessarily, but it does mean that there are reasons for differences in participation rates in different occupations that aren't a consequence of socialization. So, for example, this is especially true at the extremes. So, for example, on average, men are more interested in things and women are more interested in people. And that's actually the biggest difference we know of psychologically between men and women. And even though men and women are quite similar, all things considered, the extremes make a difference. So you imagine that in order to become an engineer, look, obviously not everyone becomes an engineer. You have to have a particular temperamental proclivity to become an engineer. You have to be extraordinarily interested in things rather than people. Well, most of those people are men. And if you want to become a nurse, well, then you have to be much more interested in people than you are in things. And most of those people are women. And so you get differences in occupational choice that are also, by the way, quite great in Scandinavia, especially in the case of engineering and nursing, that are mostly due to biological differences, and you cannot minimize that by social engineering. So, and it's not a bad thing. Like, look, one of the things you want to ask yourself is that what is the purpose of setting up a society that offers maximal equality of opportunity? And one of the answers is that you maximize people's free choice. And if you maximize free choice, then you also maximize differences in choice between people. And so you can't have both of those.
But of course it will have differences in choice, of course, because we are human beings. But I can't see why it differs between me and Skavlan, for instance. But of course it differs in biological things, but not in choices, because I think more how we raise them, how we live, education, a sort of culture, attitudes form a human being, whether or not they are a girl or a boy when they grow up. Mm-hmm. And if I raise my daughter to become a leader, to be self-confident, to have a high education, for instance, I think she will have a good platform to become a civil engineer, to become a CEO of a company, or to become a nurse.
Well, that is what people who think that the differences between people who are primarily culturally constructed believe, but it's not what the evidence suggests.
Okay, we don't agree on that.
So that's you being lazy, Jordan. That's you being lazy. By the way, throughout this whole controversy, I have told the truth at every turn.
The reason I'm defending freedom of speech, because that's how people with different opinions settle their opinions in a civil society.
Peterson, do you have any comments on the Nazi presence at your protest?
Yeah, I don't like Nazis.
Professor Peterson, let's begin with you. Why are you against the use of alternate pronouns?
I'm against the use of legislation to determine what words that myself and other people are required to utter.
But would you use alternate pronouns if a student asked you to?
I think I've made my position on that clear already.
Well, perhaps not to our audience at home who are just being introduced to this. Would you use alternate pronouns? And why not?
Because I don't believe that other people have the right to determine what language I use, especially when it's backed by punitive legislation. And when the words that are being required are the constructions, they're artificial constructions of people I regard as radical ideologues whose viewpoint I do not share.
Professor Pete, when you hear Professor Peterson saying that this is oppressive, how do you respond to that?
The Peterson drama has done real harm to real people on campus. He's made it harder to be transgender or non-binary. I know this from personal experience. I'm non-binary and transgender, and I know how it's felt to be on the U of T campus for the last month. And I also know from private communications with other affected people. A student once said to me when I finally obtained tenure, "Now, Professor, now that you have obtained superpowers, you must agree to use them for good, for peace and justice." So I invite Peterson to start doing more of that.
Well, Professor Peterson, those who are asking for this alternate use of alternate pronouns, they are saying it boils down to respecting their human rights. How do you respond to that?
I don't think it boils down to respecting their human rights. I think that it's an imposition on freedom of speech that's being implemented at a legislative level. I also think that if there was a naturally evolving solution to the linguistic problem that's being posed by a small fraction of the transgender community, that people would have already adopted it. We've never had a situation in the usage of English before that required legislation to produce a transformation in the manner in which people spoke. Has a very dangerous precedent. So it's one thing to tell people what they can't say. So for example, we have legislation making it illegal to do such things as deny the Holocaust. It's a completely different thing to demand that people use certain words when they're formulating their own ideas. In New York City, for example, there are now 31 protected gender identities, and I see no reason whatsoever why each of those gender identities can't demand the use of their own pronoun. And that absurd things like that have been happening on the University of Michigan campus, for example, where students have been given permission to tell faculty members and others what pronouns they're to be addressed by, and they're multiplying rapidly out of control. So the law is bad from an ethical perspective. It's sloppily written, and besides that, the solution that it imposes is practically untenable.
Well, I'd like to encourage people struggling with this to be kind as their first impulse. One thing I'd like you to really look at in regard to this controversy is to watch out for who's getting centered in a discussion. Political correctness is code that powerful people use when they're annoyed that they're actually not the center of attention in any given discussion. And Bill C-16 is actually not about cisgender people, it's about protections for transgender people. And that's not, it's not about Jordan Peterson.
Yeah, well, kindness is the excuse that social justice warriors use when they want to exercise control over what other people think and say. So, if we're bandying back and forth our differences in values, I would say that the highest possible value is truth, and that one of the concomitants is that we need stringent protection for freedom of speech so that we can utter the truths that we see fit. And I think that that's a value that's much higher than kindness, for example. I mean, there's lots of situations in life where kindness in the immediate present is not the appropriate way to react at all.
But
so, for example, when you discipline children, you often hurt their feelings in the short term so that they can learn to behave properly in the medium to long term so that their lives go well. And so this automatic assumption that the people on the social justice warrior side of the equation are motivated only by kindness when they're also clearly motivated by power is something I find completely untenable. And I don't think that Pete's solution to program my cell phone so that I can remember what names people need to be called is a reasonable solution at all. We're actually supposed to now use electronic devices to bolster our ability to speak freely in case we offend someone?
Is it so difficult to remember a pronoun? You remember somebody's first name, you remember their telephone number. I mean, I think that it's
I don't remember
very
people's
true
first names very easily, and I don't remember their telephone numbers very easily. And when I see a stranger, I call them by the pronoun that seems to be in accordance with their presented appearance. And
that's you
they
being
appear
lazy,
that way.
Jordan. That's you being lazy. I think there's a very high value that we should also be aiming for in addition to truth. By the way, throughout this whole controversy, I have told the truth at every turn. So, trying to imply that that's not what's happening on people on the social justice, am I a social justice warrior? I don't know. But I think that we should be aiming for pluralism. This means recognizing more than one set of fundamental principles, fostering independent cultural traditions of minorities, and being willing to share power with people who are different than you. I think if you just stop centering this whole controversy on yourself and how hard it is for you to accommodate genderqueer people, well, have a little bit of sympathy. I mean, those of us who are trans encounter much more greater indignities every day and every week of the month.
My refusal to use pronouns because left-wing activists want me to use them has nothing to do with whether or not trans people are having difficulties in society. And I'd also like to point out that I've had many letters of support.
Problem, isn't it?
I've had many letters of support from trans people, and they tell me that the trans activists don't support them, and most trans people
Jordan,
actually wanted to be referred to as he or she.
Doesn't mean
they
that
weren't
you
my
are
friends.
Untransphobic.
They
just
weren't
because
my
you
friends.
know a few people, just because you've talked to a few trans people, you don't know the trans community like the trans community does. You've got no idea what it's like to be trans.
Professor Pete, Professor Pete, I'm sorry to interrupt. Let's let Professor Peterson finish his thought, please.
All right. So, the trans activists aren't proper representatives of the trans community because they haven't been elected by the trans community.
Nobody elected you either, Jordan.
I'm not speaking for anyone except myself, and on behalf of other people, perhaps who want to maintain the right to free speech. I'm not claiming that I'm a representative of white people or white men or any other group. I'm speaking on behalf of myself.
Professor Peterson, let me jump in there, though, because we have seen an evolution of language. There are words that we don't use anymore.
Not by legislation.
Well, legislation or not, there are words that have evolved. We don't use, for example, I'm Asian. I would bristle if someone called me Oriental. That is an evolution of how we use words. How is this different, whether legislated or not?
I understand
I understand legislatively, but if at the heart of it is to allow a student to study free of what they feel is discrimination, why not help that along?
I already made my case for why not help that along. I believe that this legislation is extraordinarily dangerous, and there's other elements of it too that we haven't even got to in our society yet, like the protection for gender expression. And I've looked at gender expression in the Ontario Human Rights Code, and as far as I can tell, gender expression is best summarized in a single word: fashion. No. Because it's the way that you present yourself in public with your clothing and your manner of dress. And so I also think that the legislation that we are bringing forth with Bill C-16, and that's already in place in places like Ontario, also makes fashion criticism something akin to a hate crime. And because there's been so much noise about the identity component of this, we haven't even talked about gender expression. This is appalling legislation. And the idea that referring to someone by the pronoun of their choice is going to radically improve their status in society or their mental health is a completely unproven assumption. I think it'll have exactly the opposite effect. One thing answer for everything.
You could let
it's like
me.
It's part of the patriarchal institution.
Unless it's true, right?
Look,
Women do more,
it's not
much
capitalism.
more.
Well, for God's sake. I'm not hearing what you think. I'm hearing how you're able to represent the ideology you were taught. And it's not that interesting.
Did you have different ambitions for your daughter and for your son?
Some of them were different. I encouraged my daughter in her desire to be a mother, which is not something I did with my son.
Did you encourage him in his desire to be a father?
Absolutely.
Right, so you encouraged both of them to be a parent.
Right, but those are different.
Yeah,
I
believe.
And yeah, I mean, and in some sense, I think it's harder for young women because, of course, the problem of integrating family with career is a more complex problem for women to solve. So, and I spent a lot of time talking to her about how she might solve that. I wouldn't say that we came up with anything that was spectacularly original or successful, but I at least let her know that whatever pathway she chose was fine with me as long as she was being honest with herself about what it was that she wanted. But also that, I'm not a fan of the idea that the most fundamental orientation that a person is likely to have in their life is career. I don't believe that's true for most people. I certainly don't believe it's true for most women. And I think the evidence supports that claim quite straightforwardly. So,
however, it is the only thing that you get paid for under capitalism. Right?
Man, live.
But that's
How can
true.
you say something like that?
Paid,
it's so cliched.
Well,
it's so painful to hear that.
It may be cliche, but it nonetheless is true, right?
Look,
Women do more,
it's not
much
capitalism.
more. Well,
for God's sake.
It is.
No, it isn't. You have to invest into a child for 18 years before they have any economic utility. Mm-hmm. It's a consequence of delayed economic utility. We don't know how to monetize it. It's not a consequence of capitalism. It's a consequence of the fact that human beings have an 18-year dependency. How do you monetize that, even in principle?
Well,
we don't know.
We did used to send them up chimneys, to be fair. And at that point,
Well,
what's
true.
really interesting is at that point, children were seen as being much more the property of the man. And as they become economically useless, all the legal studies show that that's when we start moving to a model of female custody, right? Because it was about caring labour. But this is the point I'm making. Is
A model. Look, I'll tell you, there are plenty of men who are not very happy about the model of female custody. And that would,
Yes,
that
that's
would
true.
include the, what is it, 85% of men who are essentially denied 50-50 custody when they divorce and have young children. So I wouldn't think that one of our major problems, or at least a major unidimensional problem, is the proclivity of men to foist off the custody of their children onto women. There's certainly another side of that argument.
There is, and I do think that actually a lot of anger has been generated by the way we have in Britain anyway, we have or England and Wales, we have an adversarial fault-based divorce system, and that's something that's changing. But what it does is encourage people to come in on day one and say, if you want to get divorced, you're going to have to make out a case that the other person has been a bastard.
It doesn't matter, because if you move to a non-fault-based divorce system, then all that happens is the fault shifts to who should get custody.
You have a ridiculous situation where couples who say, well, actually, we've just grown apart, nonetheless, unless they want to wait 5 years or 2 years for separation, they have to go in and plead unreasonable behaviour to get a divorce and start splitting up their assets. That's the joy of no-fault divorce, is that you don't have to make those contested cases. You can simply say, our marriage is no longer working, and part ways without going into all of that acrimony. That seems quite sensible to me.
It also seems quite naive to me.
Well,
I've seen very few non-acrimonious divorces. They're very hard on kids. So I don't think anything that makes them easier is a very good idea, unless you don't think that marriage is a useful institution. And if you think that it's part of the patriarchal tyranny, then you might think that as well. So, but it's a very useful institution, mostly for kids.
I agree that I'm married. Modern marriage has a lot to recommend it. I do also think it is a patriarchal institution. It is literally...
Of course you think that,
Well,
because you think virtually everything that occurs in our society is a patriarchal institution. And it's easy to think that, because then you only have to think one thing.
You could
have a one-thing answer for everything.
You could
It's
let
like
me...
it's part of the patriarchal institution.
I don't think you're obeying the rule that says maybe treat people as if they have something worth hearing, so...
I'm not making a case for the patriarchal tyranny.
I'm gonna
And
make-
I don't think you are either. I think that you're making a case that's like a universally cliched case for the patriarchal tyranny. I don't see too
Why
much
do
of you
women change
reflected
their
in your
names?
articles at all.
Why do women change their names on marriage traditionally?
I don't know exactly. Why do you think they do?
Because it was to symbolise the transfer of their ownership from one family to another family. That's why in The Handmaid's Tale you have off Warren,
Oh
off Glenn.
God, Margaret Atwood. Well, she was just about devoured by the feminists last year, so that was something interesting to observe.
I think she made a very good point. She wasn't devoured by all feminists. I'm a feminist. I thought what she said about due process in cases like that is perfectly reasonable.
Well, many people didn't.
No, but then, guess what? This is on the internet. You can find someone who disagrees with pretty much anything. But so why do you think women change their names when they get married traditionally? If it's not about transfer of property ownership traditionally?
I don't know if I have an opinion about that. The specific reasons for that, I'd have to look into it for a fair amount of time before I decided it, but I certainly wouldn't boil it down to a unidimensional argument about the ownership of women by men. So,
Okay.
I mean, the part of the problem too is with this sort of discussion is that it's, and this is why I consider it a manifestation of ideological possession. It's predictable.
Well, that's what
knowing your
but
stance on...
But having a coherent ideology does mean that it is predictable, because
You don't need an ideology.
it is one logical thing that flows from another, and all those pieces tessellate together. So what I find very interesting about your thinking, I find it quite slightly baffling, is that I don't really see how all the pieces fit together. You say that you're not, you believe in God, but there's a lot of emphasis about
No, I
going back
actually
to...
say I act as if God exists.
Right. But,
Which is actually my definition of belief.
Okay, but that then doesn't, to me, tessellate very obviously with your insistence that we know actually it's just about pure science, and there's not a, because I can see...
What insistence that it's just about pure science?
Well,
I wrote Maps of Meaning. There's no insistence in that it's just about pure science.
Okay, but you
I
make
said that
appeals
there were
to
two
science. What I
very
mean is,
different.
you make appeals to science all the time. You say, well, this is what the literature says. And the trouble with God is that ultimately you can't say this is what the literature says. There is no literature.
Which
It is
is
an
why
act
I
of
don't
faith and
say
belief.
anything
Right.
about the scientific status of God, apart from what can be experienced maybe under certain conditions of what would you call chemical-induced mysticism, which
Right.
seems to be something that you can say something scientifically about. But I see that there's two different realms, right? There's a realm of values and a realm of facts. And in the realm of facts, science reigns supreme. But it doesn't in the realm of values. You have to look elsewhere. That was what the humanities were for, before they got, what would you say, hijacked by ideologues. And you know, the idea that something should be consistent. You were talking about the necessity for consistency in ideology. It's like, I'm not hearing what you think. I'm hearing how you're able to represent the ideology you were taught. And it's not that interesting because I don't know anything about you. I could replace you with someone else who thinks the same way. And that means you're not here. That's what it means. It's not pleasant. So you're not integrating the specifics of your personal experience with what you've been taught to synthesize something that's genuine and surprising and engaging in a narrative sense as a consequence. And that's the pathology of ideological possession. It's not good.
You have to have signed consent before making any physical move. And then that's so what? Really? Who thought that up? That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Do you know how awkward that would be?
First of all, thank you very much for being here and helping us to wake up. I really appreciate it. So my question is, as a redeemed progressive, what is the key to empowering men in the Me Too age while maintaining healthy boundaries and strong behavioural expectations?
We've had relatively reliable birth control since 1960. Okay, that's not very long. And we underestimate the unbelievable technological triumph of birth control. It's the hydrogen bomb, it's the transistor, like it's a major league transformation in human interaction. Women are now free from involuntary reproduction. That's never been the case in the entire history of the planet. Okay, we don't know exactly what to do about that. Okay, so the first idea in the 60s was, hell, let's party. And you know, you could see why. It's like, what the rules for not engaging in promiscuous sexual intercourse seemed to have vanished. So we had a couple of decades of experimentation. It's like, well, how'd that go? Little hard on the family, I would say. That's not so good for kids. AIDS, that wasn't a plus. Could have killed us all. And it mutated, particularly to take advantage of promiscuous sex, because viruses are very tricky things. So it turns out that sex is a little bit more complicated than we thought. Well, it actually turns out that it's a lot more complicated than we think. Okay, and now it's 50, 60 years later, and we're trying to sort this out. It's like, well, when is it okay to have sex? Exactly. And when is it not okay to have sex? And what does it mean that it's okay? And what does consent mean? And the answer to that is, well, we never used to have to think these things through because the rule was don't have sex until you get married. That was the rule. Now that isn't the rule. Okay, so what's the rule? Well, we're not having a conversation about the rule. We're waiting till someone does something that seems like it might be untoward and then mobbing them and trying to extract the rule out that way. And it's not a very effective way of doing it. You know, you want to decrease campus rape? That's easy. Get rid of alcohol. No one has that conversation. It's like I did my PhD work on alcohol. 50% of the people who are murdered are drunk, and 50% of the people who kill them are drunk. And almost all the date rape situations are consequences of excess intoxication. But yet there's a party culture on campuses and anything goes. And you also have this strange thing, especially on the radical left, which is unbelievably paradoxical, where absolutely every form of sexual expression imaginable is 100% permissible because sex is fine, but it's so dangerous that while you're dancing with someone at a Princeton mixer, you have to ask them 2 or 3 times if it's okay for you to continue. And that's actually the case, by the way. I'm not making that up. It's like, well, both of those things can't be true. Now, what's happening, I think, on the Me Too end of things and the affirmative consent end of things is the old sexual taboos are reasserting themselves. The idea that we can extract sex out from emotional intimacy, and especially emotional intimacy, I would say, psychological intimacy, maybe even from long-term relationship, I don't believe it's a tenable idea. I don't think we can do it. And a lot of what we're seeing is the backlash against that. It's like, well, I feel used. You know, because one of the things that's happening on the really radical end of the anti-sexual abuse movement is the idea that, well, if you have intercourse with someone and then you regret it the next day, that's evidence that it wasn't consensual. Well, it is, in a sense, evidence that it wasn't consensual, because it's evidence that you didn't bloody well think it through, right? It was good for last night, but it's not good for today. It's not very wise. The question is, well, what constitutes consent? And we need to have a very serious conversation about that. Like, under what circumstances is it acceptable to give consent? But we're not mature enough to have that conversation. We want it both ways. We want to be able to do whatever we want, with whoever we want, whenever we want, with no consequences, and we want there never to be any trouble about consent. It's like, well, no, that's not going to happen. I don't think that sex works very well outside of committed relationships. I don't think there's any evidence that it does. There's a strong proclivity across cultures for the enforcement, social enforcement of long-term monogamy. And there's reasons for that. And I think you deviate from that at your peril. So now, if you want to deviate from that, there's all sorts of reasons to do it. And I can understand why people are interested in adventure and all of that. But, you know, my sense also as a clinician is, you know, you only really get to try out about 5 people in your life. You have to make a decision pretty damn quick. You know, like between 20 and 30, there's a lot of things to get straight, and long-term mate is usually one of them. And most of the time, people should be more careful with their sexual behavior when they're young, especially when they're drunk, than they are. And I just think it's so interesting that all of the taboo reconstruction is coming from the radical left. It's not what you'd expect at all. You'd think it'd be the damn right-wing Christians complaining about, you know, sexual immorality. It's like, no, it's the radical lefties, you know. You have to have signed consent before making any physical move. And then that's so what? Really? Who thought that up? That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. You know how awkward that would be? You know, you're supposed to be able to do a little bit of nonverbal reading, right? I mean, that's part of romance. You don't see it. You ever see a movie where the 2 people who are dating exchange consent notes? Like, that doesn't happen. So it's an unrealistic solution. But I think the real solution is that despite the fact that we have reliable birth control, we're going to have to relearn what the acceptable rules of propriety are with regards to sexual relationships. One of the things I often tell my young clients is, don't do anything physically with anyone that you wouldn't talk to them about. Because if you're too damn embarrassed to talk about it, well, maybe it's a little premature in the relationship to actually do it. And then there's harm in it. You know, there's emotional harm in it on both parties. There's the cheapening of both parties. So it's going to take us a long time to sort this out. But hopefully we can do it in a serious manner, and it won't be merely a matter of mobbing those who seem to have made an error. We know what happens if people act poorly, if men act badly. We know that the world turns into something that's so close to hell that the difference is trivial. That's the story of the 20th century.
Give them this message that it's okay to be a man.
It's not okay. It's necessary.
Why do you think there is such a crisis of masculinity in the first place, and why are there so many people out there who are angry at you for even talking to men?
What I see happening to young men in particular, boys as well, not just young men, and maybe even, maybe starting at the age of toddlers, is that we have this sense in the world that human beings live in antagonism to nature and that we're actually a malevolent force. And that our social structures, which are clearly capable of the commission of atrocity, are fundamentally oppressive, patriarchal in their nature. And so then if you're a male in a society with that ethos, the motive force that drives you into the world to live is associated with rapaciousness and despoliation on the natural front, and then oppression and atrocity on the social front. It's like, well then, if you're the least bit conscientious, because this sort of accusation hurts conscientious young men the most, then the best you can do is, well, let's say castrate yourself. How would that be? And that would be real comical, except that it's also happening. That's why I think there's a crisis. And there's something serious at the root of it, right? Because we do have to take the potential damage we can do to the natural world and the social world. We have to take that seriously, but the proper consequence of taking that seriously is not to commit hara-kiri, let's say, in a fit of moral anxiety and take yourself completely out of the game. But that's the insistence now, and it's really, and I see that psychoanalytically, you know, I see that as a manifestation at a symbolic level of something like, well, symbolically, that's associated with the devouring mother, right? It's an overweening and destructive false compassion that has this devouring quality. But then there's another issue too, which I think is germane. Because of family fragmentation, there's a very large number of women who have, just like there's a very large number of men who have never had a real word of encouragement in their whole life. It's a really sad thing to see. It's a really, really sad thing to see that deeply and to have seen that reflected in so many thousands of people. But there are many women who've never had a positive relationship with anyone male in their life. And so one of the consequences of that, we know, for example, that younger women are more likely to be attracted to men who show dark triad traits, narcissistic, Machiavellian, and psychopathic. And people who have those traits are characterized by the mimicry of competence. And so what women want in men more than anything else is competent generosity, and the data on that are very clear. But you can mimic that if you're narcissistic, and if you're a young woman, you can be deluded by that. It's partly because it points to the problem of dissociating competent confidence from the expression of power per se. So we could call power, I'll define that as the willingness and ability to use compulsion to attain your aims. Now, if you are someone who has a proclivity to manifest power, then that looks like the manifestation of both ambition and will. And if you haven't had a positive relationship with anyone masculine in your life, and maybe with not even with your own internal masculinity, say, you can't discriminate between power and the ambition that serves competence. And so because that's terrifying, because the power, if you have had only negative relationships with men, their capability to use power becomes such a threat that it has to be opposed at all costs, even if it manifests itself within the developmental pathway of your own son.
How would you summarize why men are in crisis now?
I think it's because in a deep level, the West has lost faith in the idea of masculinity. Now, that's no different than the death of God. It's the same thing. And Nietzsche knew what the consequence of that would be. I mean, that's most of what he wrote about, you know, and so you'd say, well, the divine symbol of masculinity has been obliterated. Well, so then what do you expect? What's going to happen? That means masculinity is going to become weak. And especially if the symbol is also denigrated, right? Which it definitely is. So what that means is that the ideal that man could aspire to is denigrated. And well, then with your ideal in tatters, you're weak. That's definitional. I think the reason that men have been responding positively to my thinking, let's say, is that I don't buy any of that. I like the masculine spirit. It's necessary, and it's not fundamentally carnage and pillaging. It's not fundamentally rape culture. You know, it's not fundamentally world destroying. And all of those things all of those aspersions have been cast upon it.
What is a masculinity we can aspire to?
Well, it's a responsibility fundamentally, and it's to put it symbolically is that your responsibility is to incarnate the spirit of the Logos. That's your responsibility. That's your role in life. But we know what happens if people act poorly, if men act badly. We know what happens. We know that the world turns into something that's so close to hell that the difference is trivial. We know that. That's the story of the 20th century. So we should learn that lesson. And what that lesson is pick up the world on your shoulders and walk forward. Pick up the world with all of its trouble, with all of its suffering, with all of its evil, and move forward with it. And in bearing that burden, learn that you're the sort of creature that can bear that burden and therefore deserving of respect.
We've met some of your fans, and we got the impression they were all male fans, the ones that we talked to, and that they were struggling with their manhood, and that you give them this message that it's okay to be a man.
It's not okay. It's necessary. What the hell are we going to do without men? You look around the city here, you see all these buildings go up, these men, they're doing impossible things. They're under the streets, working on the sewers, they're up on the power lines, in the storms and the rain. They're keeping this impossible infrastructure functioning, this thing that works in a miraculous manner. They work themselves to death, and often literally. And the gratitude for that is sorely lacking, especially among the people who should be most grateful. You see university professors, especially of the social justice bent, who are among the most protected and privileged people that the world has ever produced. They take everything they have for granted, failing to understand entirely that there's a massive infrastructure of unbelievably hardworking, solidly laboring, working class men breaking themselves in half on a regular basis, making sure that everything that always breaks works. And so a little gratitude for that is in order. And it's very useful to tell everyone, not just men, that they have an important role to play, a necessary role, and that if they act properly and honestly and forthrightly, that they can put their lives together and they can help their families and they can make their communities better, and that that's not toxic masculinity, that appalling phrase. It's what keeps the world going round.
In the West, because we're very immature, we think that the purpose of a marriage is the happiness of the people who are involved in the marriage, the husband and the wife. And that's just not the purpose of marriage at all. The purpose is long-term facilitation of their psychological and spiritual development and the establishment of an environment that's beneficial to children. Freud was no dummy when he pointed to the fact that the devouring mother was one of the major impediments to proper human development. He knew that, looking deep into the darkest families and seeing this proclivity of the overprotective mother to destroy the developing integrity of the child, to keep the child infantile, to cling to that relationship instead of developing a life for herself and letting the child go flourish. That's Hansel and Gretel, right? You're lost in the woods. Why? Well, your family's broken up. You have an evil stepmother, so now you're lost in the woods. What's your abuse rate if you have a step-parent? 100 times normal. So you're lost in the woods. Well, what happens? Well, you come across a gingerbread house. Well, that's pretty damn convenient. You need a house. It's more than you could even hope for. It's not just a house. It's a house made out of candy. Well, what's inside a house made out of candy? A witch who wants to fatten you up and eat you. And that's the devouring mother, and that's an old fairy tale. Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, and so, we could dwell on that for a minute too. One of the things we won't honestly discuss in our society, one of many, is the fundamental nature of female political psychopathology. And there's male political psychopathology, obviously. That's what the feminists complain about all the time when they talk about the oppressive patriarchy, toxic masculinity. There's no shortage of toxic masculinity. So is there any toxic femininity? Well, not if the feminine is just the, oppressed virgin goddess whose nature, but how about we don't live in that fantasy world?
And we know, yeah, there's female political pathology, the tendency to infantilize everyone, and the tendency to assume that everyone who doesn't go along with the infantilization is properly characterized as a predator. And so, you know, you wonder, why are the universities turning into extended daycares? Well, a lot of the reason for that is that women who don't have anything better to do are turning the university students into the infants they never had. So, yeah.
Jesus.
So, I don't know when we'll be able to be mature enough to have that conversation. You know, 20 years from now.
What is a path to bring this back to some sort of rational, logical way of discussing these problems?
We're trying to put together something like an alternative vision of the future, say an alternative to that kind of apocalyptic narrative that's being put forward, at least implicitly, by organizations like the WEF, you know, and that's the virginal planet, rapacious tyrant, you know, all-devouring consumer religion. And it's more like something like, well, we want to ask people 6 key questions. Okay, so how do we get energy and resources at the lowest possible cost, as rapidly as possible, to the largest number of people around the world? That's one question. And so there's a presumption in the question, and here's one of the presumptions. You don't get to save the planet by making energy prices so expensive that no one poor can afford them. That's off the table. So if you want to develop alternative energy sources, no problem. You know, because, hey man, the more energy sources we have, the better. But you don't get to impose your utopian vision in the service of your narcissism on the poor. We're going to try to make the poor rich, going to try to alleviate absolute poverty. Pro-human view. On environmental stewardship front, that's the next question. What are the major problems that are confronting us? How do we take a sophisticated, multidimensional view of that? How do we prioritize our attempts to establish our states and our international relationships properly so that we prioritize human well-being, you know, in harmony with nature to the degree that's possible, but human-focused and not predicated on the idea that there are too many goddamn mouths on the planet to feed and that you're evil if you just think about having children. So then on the governance front, this is where it gets kind of more left-wing, I would say, is none of the people involved in this consortium so far are very thrilled with global corporate fascist government media and corporation collusion. You know, and we're seeing this at the high end. It's like a Tower of Babel, is that the powerful players in the world are increasingly collaborating to impose a top-down vision of the future on everyone. And that's a future that's predicated on a zero-growth model. And the idea that, well, we'd need 5 planets really to support everyone at the current standard of living that obtains in the West. So the best pathway forward is to deny loans by the World Bank to developing countries so they can't develop, you know, energy sources, which all that'll mean is they're going to burn wood and coal, obviously. So that's the third question is, you know, how do we arrange systems of governance to stop the march of something like pathological gigantism? This is why I like people like Russell Brand and also you to some degree politically, you know, because you guys are very, what would you say, sensitive to the danger of that kind of corrupt collusion, that regulatory capture that occurs when corporate entities and media entities and governmental entities are all in bed together, like the FDA and the CDC and so forth and so on without end. So that's the third question. The fourth question is, what do we put forward as a vision on the family policy front to facilitate the, what would you call it, the encouragement and the maintenance of long-term monogamous couples who are child-centered, and to make increasing the birth rate part of that policy, to put policies in place that would support long-term stable monogamous families, 2-parent families, and child-centered. You know, because in the West, because we're very immature, we think that the purpose of a marriage is the happiness of the people who are involved in the marriage, the husband and the wife. And that's just not the purpose of marriage at all. The purpose is long-term facilitation of their psychological and spiritual development and the establishment of an environment that's beneficial to children. That's a responsible way of thinking about it. And so we need to have a serious conversation about what that means. And, you know, it's tricky because, like, I think the ideal has to be long-term committed monogamous heterosexual relationships. And I had a big conversation about this with Dave Rubin. You know, Rubin's gay and he's married, and him and his partner now have 2 infants, and we talked through how that was. It's a very hard thing for them to arrange, obviously. Why? Well, they're both male. So that poses a severe problem on the reproductive front, right? And so they manage that. They have 2 infants, but it's very complex, and it's obviously not a solution to the problem of relationship and reproduction that's duplicatable across large numbers of people. It just takes too many resources. Now, I do think we have to have an ideal at the center of every concept. But the ideal can't be too rigid, because people aren't perfect. In my own family, there's lots of people who are divorced. In lots of people's families, there are people who are gay. There are lots of people in unhappy marriages. Nobody attains the ideal. So the ideal has to be surrounded by a fringe of tolerance, but that doesn't mean you sacrifice the ideal. And the ideal has to be, well, we know there's a literature on fatherlessness. It's a bloody catastrophe. Racism is a global and vague term.
Sorry, but why would you possibly do that? What did that mean?
Because I said it was a global and vague term.
The inverted commas is that it's not a real thing.
No, that isn't what it meant.
Well, what did it mean then? Explain.
It meant that I know a lot of people who have staggeringly successful careers, and they're often loath to go into a political field despite the tremendous expertise they've developed, because they have to put everything that they've already accomplished on hold or in hawk, in a sense, to enter the public sphere. And I think one of the problems with that is that the most highly competent people in many fields are dissuaded from a political career because it requires the unproductive sacrifice of everything they've built. And so what that does, in some sense, is deprive us of some of the best people who could be considering politics as a mode of public service. And so that's a complicated problem to try to solve.
Why do we assume that such people are the best people? They're obviously not
Well, because
the best
they've
people for the
demonstrated
job.
extreme competence in at least one area of their
That's
career.
banking, that's that persona. This is why we're in the situation where we are, with people like politicians that we have at the moment that are corrupt. There's no transparency, there's no accountability that you get in industry, and we don't even have it in our politics at the moment.
But that's not
because
why
of
you
this
have corruption.
attitude
No.
that what is perceived as a good leader.
No,
And
that's not why you have that
issue
problem.
is.
Most people who are successful in their given field aren't corrupt. It's very difficult to become successful and be corrupt.
So
I know
we're making
people
that
like to think
assumption.
that, but it's just not true.
Corruption is good, it's acceptable.
Look, 3% of the population is psychopathic, and it never really goes above that. And the reason that it never goes above that is because being psychopathic is not a very good strategy. And so the idea that people in power are corrupt, by definition, especially if they've built up their stature and influence as a consequence of competence, is simply wrong. And so you do want people who've demonstrated high levels of competence in at least one other field to serve as potential political candidates. What else would you use as a criteria for their ability? It's absolutely the case that institutions have a proclivity towards corruption under some circumstances. That's true of all institutions. But to blindly assume that that's more characteristic, let's say, of your political leaders than it is of you, for example, as a person, it's an empty sort of cynicism. It doesn't serve people well, and it's not true of reasonable governments or countries. It's simply not true.
The revelations from cricket's Azim Rafiq.
Former cricketer Azim Rafiq this morning stood before politicians ready to give his honest and powerful testimony about the racist treatment he says he was forced to endure during his time playing for Yorkshire County Cricket Club.
I felt isolated, humiliated at times, constant use of the word. In 2017 pre-season tour, we were in a place and Gary Balance walks over and goes, "Why are you talking to him? You know he's a or he's not a sheikh, he's got no oil."
And footballers still taking the knee. What does this say about racism as a continuing undercurrent in present-day Britain?
Things need to be particularized rather than generalized, as a general rule, let's say. And so this cricket player was facing racism by his own count. The question is, who, when, what, exactly? Because otherwise it degenerates into something like a discussion of structural racism. And when it becomes abstracted up to that level, first of all, that pits group against group, which I think is entirely counterproductive. And it actually doesn't address the issue. You know, racism is a global and vague term.
Sorry, but why would you possibly do that? What did that mean?
because I said it was a global and vague term.
The inverted commas as if it's not a real thing. What did?
No, that isn't what it meant.
Well, what did it mean then? Explain.
It meant that it's indicative of low resolution thinking. And what I mean by that is we use all these terms frequently in discussions like this that are
he was
containers
called
of undifferentiated
He
content.
was repeatedly called abusive terms directly linked to his ethnicity.
By who?
By not just one, but repeated members of the Yorkshire Cricket Club. He's
Okay,
had people
well,
contact him.
then
If it
they-
walks like a duck, Jordan,
Then they
talks like a
no,
duck,
I'm not
it's a
denying-
duck. It's racism.
I'm not denying his experience.
Right.
What I asked was exactly who and when, and you just answered that
Yes.
question. So I would say those specific people should be held specifically to account for their actions before any movement up the abstraction hierarchy to a discussion of something like structural racism, which I don't think is helpful.
Well, he has talked about institutional racism in cricket. He says that's what he's experienced as a term, institutional racism.
Right, I know. And like I said, I believe that abstracting up the problem to that level of analysis does no good because it pits groups against groups. I think it exacerbates the problem, the concept of structural racism. It's too imprecise. It doesn't address the issue. Now, that does not mean racism does not exist. That is not what I'm saying in the least.
Maybe let's do less of the hand movements and
Well,
let's
I
look
did
at the
it once,
evidence
so yes,
that there
I'll
was.
try
So
to
the evidence
control it
was
in the future.
about the experience that Azim had, about multiple accounts. I think when we talk about structural racism, one of the things that really occurs to me, if I think about it in lay men and women's terms, is the bystander effect. And what is so powerful about his testimony is not just the explicit racism that he faced, it's the numbers of people who stood by and basically normalised that behaviour. We have a problem in British society, we have a problem particularly in sport, and we also have a problem when it comes to our definitions of racism, because people tend to lump people of different minority community backgrounds together. You know,
And how do you talk about structural racism without
I'm going to need to bring up Peterson as well.
But the thing for me that I think is so powerful is this concept of the bystander, is the idea of the person who may think of themselves not as a racist, who may not have joined in this poor young man being bullied in the way that he was.
Yes, I need to mention
nothing.
Stella simply because he has talked about it himself today, Azim Rafiq, that he has apologised for some anti-Semitic tweets that he put out several years ago.
And what I think is really powerful is how clear and compelling his apology is and how he's recognised it.
If we had to make a bad drug legal, the worst choice was alcohol. Yeah, and the funny thing is, if you're trying to stop drinking, you need something better than alcohol. And alcohol's pretty good.
Yeah.
So you better find something a lot better, man. Yeah, and it is. And then estimable people do estimable things. It's like, yeah, well, you want to figure out something that you're doing with your life that's worth not getting drunk and screwing up.
Yeah.
Right? Because that's fun. You might say, well, why do people drink too much? It's like, if you like alcohol, that's a stupid question.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, why do people drink too much? Well, because it's great.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, okay, so why stop? Well, you do stupid things when you're drunk. You hurt yourself. You compromise your health. It's really hard on the people around you. You tend to turn into a liar, and it screws up your life.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, but it's pretty fun. Yeah, well, it is. But you need something better than that. And what's better isn't being straight and not making mistakes. It's like that's all prohibition in some sense. What's better is, no, you need an adventure, man. You need to get out there and have something to do.
Yeah.
And something worth waking up for. And that's the substitute for the addiction. Actually, the addiction is the substitute for that, if truth be known. I'm sure this must have happened when you decided to stop drinking. You must have thought, this isn't good.
I'm not going to be funny anymore. I thought that.
Okay.
I thought there was going to be ramifications. Yeah.
Okay, and so what were they? What did you foresee happening?
I thought I wouldn't be funny. I thought that people wouldn't like me. I thought that I wouldn't be able to meet girls if I wasn't drinking or having drugs or.
Right, so that was what you were afraid of giving up if you stopped drinking.
Right.
What were you afraid of happening if you kept drinking?
I was afraid of not achieving my dreams. I was afraid of ending up a drug addict. I was afraid of dying in my sleep. Something, or dying under the influence.
Okay, so yeah, it's not like that doesn't happen to comedians.
Right,
it happens a lot.
Yeah, it's one of our go-to moves.
Well, exactly. Well, it's not an occupational hazard because you're up late at night and you're around bars all the time. It is because you're up late at night and you're
Chris
partying
Farley right here.
Right.
Happened to him.
Well, and it happened to all sorts of comedians and rock musicians. It usually happens at about 27. So you were afraid you're going to die, or you're afraid you're going to become addicted. So let's say what would have life been like you for you if you were addicted? So you don't have a career anymore.
No.
Right? So you've given all that up and failed. So that's fun. So that's going to drive you even more towards drugs.
Yeah, it would have been all my dreams. It would have been miserable.
Right.
It would have been hell.
Exactly. So why quit drinking? So I don't end up in hell. Hey, there's a reason to stop. And then if you make that hell real, it's like, here's all the details of my personal hell. Yes, let's avoid that.
Right.
So then you have something to run the hell away from.
Right. So now you have something towards and something to run away from. And I'll say this too, if there's any young men or women out there who are listening to Jordan feeling like, well, I don't know if I start doing something different, like my friends are going to act a certain.
Yeah, they are.
They are.
Yeah, that's
But you're
right.
you're going to start creating conversations. You're going to become the intrigue because you're going to be bringing something new to the table.
You're also going to find out who your friends are.
Yeah.
Because if you're starting to put your life together and you have friends that object, those are not friends. Those are just people you know. They're not friends, because a friend is someone, this is one of the hallmarks of a friend. Here's 2 hallmarks. A friend is someone you can tell bad news to, and they won't tell you why you're an idiot, and they won't interfere with your suffering. They'll just listen, and maybe they'll suffer along with you. Okay, so you can tell bad news to them, and they won't tell you some worse thing that happened to them. They'll listen, and they'll suffer along with you. But a friend is also someone you can tell good news to. And the friend will say, wow, in this veil of tears, something good happened to you. Great, man.
Congrats.
I'm wonderful. It's rare. It's unlikely. Good for you. I hope 10 more things like that happen. And they're not envious, and they're not jealous, and they're not one-upping you. And if you're trying to get your life together, if you're trying to get your life together and your friends get in the way, that's actually real useful for you, because you've now identified who your friends aren't. And you might think, well, I can't give them up. It's like, oh, yes, you can. And not only can you should, and it would be better for them. Because if they're aiming down and they want you going down with them, there's nothing good about what's happening to them, and there's certainly nothing good about that for you.
Yeah, they're not going to, and then they're going to learn, wow, I'm going to lose friends if I continue in these directions. Yeah.
Exactly.
Why is it hard for people to let go of what's so familiar to them, even if it's bad?
Well, because it's complicated. And the thing, that's a really good question. You discount the risk of familiarity that you're familiar with. So like, let's say...
Because people are in relationships with the drugs and alcohol. People are in relationships with humans. People are in relationships with jobs. People are in relationships with their own selves. And they're living a lie every single day, but it's familiarity.
Yeah, well, you say, I have a job I hate. It's like, well, yeah, but I'm not dying from it. It's like not as bad as it can be. So you factored in the risks already. They get invisible. You think, well, I can't jump out of this job because what about all the risk? It's like, yeah, no kidding. You got to get your resume in order. You got to send it out. You got to send 50 of the damn things out before anybody will call you back. Then you have to go get interviewed, and maybe you're not any good at that. You have to come up with a story while you're a good employee, and maybe you're not yet. So you have to figure out how to do that. It's like, what about all these risks if I go look for a new job? It's like, yeah, absolutely, man. Those are risks, and they're harsh, and no wonder you're avoiding them. What about the risks for you to stay with this job you absolutely hate? Well, let's think that through. Okay, so I have this dead-end job. I hate it. I'm getting bitter. Where am I going to be in 5 years? I know where, because I've watched this with people. You're going to be just like you are now, except a lot more of what's good about you is going to be gone, and a lot more of what's terrible is going to be amplified. And you're going to be like, in 5 years, you're going to be 10 years older instead of 3 years older.
Yeah.
Right. And
because it kills your spirit somehow.
Oh, man. Yeah. So it's like you think, oh, my God, there's a terrible risk in pursuing this new job. It's like, yeah, there is a terrible risk. There's a terrible risk in you staying with your job right now. And so one of the things that's really freeing to understand is that you're screwed no matter what you do. There's no secure path forward. Give it up. It's risk everywhere. You think, oh, my God, that's terrible. It's like, yes, except for 2 things. You can pick your risk. That's the first thing. So you get to pick your poison. That's something. And second, you're a lot tougher than you think. So even though there's risk everywhere, if you confront it forthrightly, what you'll find is that you can actually handle the risk. And that's the security. If you really like alcohol, it does 2 things to you. It makes you more extroverted and enthusiastic while you're on the ascending limb of the blood alcohol curve, which is why you have to keep drinking once you start. Because if you plateau, that goes away. So you got to keep drinking. Okay, so that's one thing. It makes you more enthusiastic and more full of positive emotion. And the second thing it does is reduce anxiety.
Yeah.
And so if you are a bit more socially anxious, and you also have that positive response to alcohol, which everyone doesn't have, by the way, then it's a great drug. But the problem is, it's a great drug for the moment.
Right.
Right. There's consequences.
Yeah, the sounds when it's not great.
Well, it also, alcohol is an interesting drug because it actually doesn't make people stupid. This has been tested. Like, people who are drunk will take far more risk. And you might say, well, that's because they're too stupid to understand the risk. It's like, no, they're not. If you ask them about the risk when they're drunk, they can outline it perfectly. What it stops them from doing is caring about the risk. It's actually, and that's part of the anti-anxiety component. It's like, yeah, the risk is, that's why you can drive around drunk at high speed in a car, which is a really stupid thing to do.
Yeah.
We used to do that in the back roads of northern Alberta. It's fun.
Yeah.
You know, but people died all the time doing it, especially in the winter. It's like, wow, this is great. It's great until your head's gone through the windshield, you know, like so many things.
Yeah.
You know, it's like jumping off a cliff. I'm flying, which is true until the last 1/10 of a second. It's like, then you're not flying, man. It's like, yeah. So alcohol has exactly that effect. It is a great anti-anxiety drug, but it does stop you, and he said it stopped you from learning the skills that you need in a social circumstance to be able to cope with that. So then it actually stops you from dealing with the anxiety. You don't have to learn how to overcome it. That's not good. Yeah, and alcohol also makes people aggressive. It's the only drug we know that actually makes people aggressive. So you see a massive effect on crime rates because half the people who murder someone are drunk.
Oh, yeah.
And half the people who are murdered are drunk. And, you know, and you're most likely to be murdered by a family member.
Yeah.
So I've been joking with my audiences is like, well, if you really want to get killed, the best thing to do is go drink with a family member. So, which is actually statistically true, which is terribly, terribly comical. It's like, yeah, go get drunk with your family if you want to die.